a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for coming. Everyone, this is great to be here. So yeah, I'll just talk a bit about my book, and then I'm going to read a bit from it, and then actually a bit of an experiment plan, which should go very well, very poorly, but looking forward to it nonetheless. So this is a book about books, but kind of written with numbers. And essentially, it's not trying to reverse engineer the perfect novel or anything like that. It's kind of a celebration of books and kind of finding hidden patterns that you wouldn't know kind of unless you took a step back and looked through the data. And just to clarify a bit, it's kind of coming from the writer's point of view. You know, Stephen King said in his book on writing not to use ly adverbs, but if you read if you counted all 5 million words he ever wrote, does he actually follow his own advice? Is there a difference between men and women and how they write about male and female characters? There's one chapter in the book where I kind of go through that, and just as an example, you know, females may describe their male and female characters as interrupting just as often as one another, but male characters actually skew where they have their female characters interrupting at a really kind of crazy rate compared to their male characters. And the kind of more silly things. Does an author's name grow after they get a New York Times bestseller on their book cover? Like, what is our favorite author's favorite words? Are there any kind of tick words that come through? So I'm going to read actually the preface of this book, kind of go through it. It's actually based on a study that kind of inspired me to get more into this, based on a study on word frequencies from over 50 years ago. And I'll get into the actual, what the study was looking at soon. But back then, they had to cut through pieces of paper and kind of stack them up just to count the words and how often they appeared. And now with kind of like the accessibility of files and just computers, it's very easy to go through and kind of find new and exciting stuff. So thanks all for coming. I'm going to read and then we will get through it. So this is actually a study that was done in the 1960s on the Federalist Papers, just to give some historical context, but I will get into the introduction. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, or John Jay. For more than 150 years, historians argued over the authorship of 12 essays in the Federalist Papers, founding documents in the American march towards democracy. Though the essays are world-famous hallmarks in the lexicon of American history, the specific authors of each one remain unknown. The question of which founding father penned the essays had sparked such endless debate that it had devolved into a popular parlor game among historians. Just who exactly wrote the stirring arguments upon which our governing structure was based? The answer was hidden in the words themselves, but to find them, scholars needed not a close reading, but a close counting. They needed to look at the numbers. The mystery began in late 1787, when a series of essays advocating the ratification of the Constitution was published in New York newspapers under the pen name Publius. Shielding the true identities of the authors with a patriotic nom de plume was a somewhat farcical endeavor. In fact, of the near 4 million people living in the United States in 1787, all but 3 could be eliminated from contention. It was an open secret that Hamilton, Madison, and Jay were the authors, but none of the 3 wanted to step forward and admit to writing any particular essays. Each had political ambitions, later rising to the ranks of Secretary of the Treasury, President, and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, respectively, so they weren't without good reason. But their excess of caution left the mystery of the authorship intact, titillating history professors and armchair enthusiasts alike for many years to come. You might think that the scholars and astute politicos of the day would have been able to determine the authorship on their own. There were only 3 potential candidates, after all, each with his own political stand and style of communication. It would have been the equivalent of an anonymous editorial in the New York Times penned by Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, or Bernie Sanders, or an unsigned manifesto by George W. Bush, John McCain, or Donald Trump. All might be coming from the same side, but they certainly weren't all identical. In 1804, a solution finally seemed to emerge. Hamilton wrote a letter to his friend Egbert Benson, listing the author of each essay. Hamilton was preparing to duel Aaron Burr. He sensed both the historical significance of the Federalist Papers and of his chances of survival. He decided not to let his knowledge of the authorship die with him. This should have been the end of the mystery. A nation of curious observers had no reason to doubt Hamilton's first-hand knowledge. Yet 13 years later, soon after his second term as president ended, Madison put out his own list of authorship, one that differed from Hamilton's. 12 of the essays that Hamilton claimed to have written were also claimed by Madison. This reopened the debate with a new fervor, fueling spats among historians for more than a century. In 1892, future Senator Henry Cabot Lodge wrote on the topic, siding with Hamilton, while noted historian E.J. Bourne went with Madison. Most historians tried to tease out the authors based on the political ideology presented in each essay. Would Madison really have argued for a central bank in those certain terms? Would Hamilton have supported the limits of Congress so freely? Or maybe that's something John Jay would have written. It wasn't until 1963, 2 centuries later, that the mystery was at long last solved. The definitive answer came from respected professors Frederick Mosteller of Harvard University and David Wallace of the University of Chicago. However, unlike the many professors who had attempted to solve the question before them, Mosteller and Wallace were not historians. They were not known for their scholarly work on early America. They had never published a paper on historical figures at all. Mosteller and Wallace were statisticians. One of Mosteller's most noteworthy papers before dealt with the World Series and whether or not 7 games was enough to statistically determine the best baseball team. Just a few years prior to looking into the authorship program, Wallace had published a paper with the name Bounds on Normal Approximations to Students in the Chi-Square Distributions, which probably sounds as close to nonsense to you as the thought of probability functions solving historical mysteries sounded to the history professors in 1963. Mosteller and Wallace's methodology for ending the authorship debate had nothing to do with politics or ideologies. Instead, they were 2 of the first statisticians to leverage word frequency and probability. Their process was in some ways complex, featuring equations with factorials, exponents, summations, logarithms, and t-distributions. But the heart of their method was strikingly simple. Step 1, count the frequency of common words in essays that we know Hamilton or Madison definitely wrote. Step 2, count the frequency of those same words in essays where the author is unknown. And step 3, compare these frequencies to determine the author of the disputed essays. Even before any of the fancy probabilistic equations came into play, the results of the statistician's approach seemed wonderfully obvious in retrospect. In the Federalist Papers, Madison used the word whilst in over half the essays in which his authorship had been confirmed, but he never once used the word while. Hamilton, meanwhile, used the word while in about 1/3 of his essays, but never used whilst. Mosteller and Wallace did not rely on a single word for their analysis, however. That would not have been statistically sound. Instead, they systematically chose dozens of basic words and then found the frequency of each word in the disputed essays. Many words, entirely non-political in meaning, turned out to have drastically different usage rates between the 2 authors. For example, Madison used also twice as often as Hamilton, while Hamilton used according much more frequently than Madison. Mosteller and Wallace had falsibility on their side. They could show that by using the same methods on paper where the author was known, they could determine the authorship with perfect results. Of the 12 disputed essays, Mosteller and Wallace concluded that James Madison was the actual author of all 12. The question Mosteller and Wallace asked and answered was limited in scope, but text analysis can answer a huge range of questions that have intrigued curious writers and readers for generations. Did Ernest Hemingway actually use fewer adverbs than other writers? How does reading level affect the popularity of a book? Do men and women write differently? Do writers follow their own advice? And is that advice any good? What, besides superficial spellings, distinguishes American and British novelists? From Vladimir Nabokov to E.L. James, what are our favorite authors' favorite words? The analytical approach to writing can be amusing and informative and often downright funny. Moreover, it can teach us about the writers we read every day and the words we use in our own writing. That's what we'll delve into in this book, devoting each chapter to a new literary experiment. The research won't be painfully complex, it doesn't need to be, and shouldn't be, in order to be worthwhile. Many obvious and intriguing questions about classic literature or the modern bestseller could be viewed through a statistical lens, but just haven't been framed that way yet. This book is about tackling these simple yet unique questions in a new way. It's a book about words that is paradoxically written with numbers. So that the preface of my book, the introduction, is about the Federalist Papers and whether or not words were consistent throughout the authors there. And most of the rest of the book is actually about the novel and how kind of writers function in that space. But the cool thing about the Mosteller and Wallace study on the Federalist Papers is that it showed that writers across different works and different times have a very reliable pattern of words use that can be kind of measured and shown to be their own. For example, J.K. Rowling switched from a children's fantasy book to kind of an adult gritty book that she wrote under a pen name. But would you be able to tell, looking at her style, the word frequencies, that despite the genre and audience change, that this is the same novelist. So, as a bit of an experiment, in relation to this kind of literary fingerprint, I've actually built an app that I want to test out here. So I know your phones are on silent, but if you can take them out, if you have an iPhone, if you don't have an iPhone, maybe partner up with someone who does. But if you haven't done it already, go to the App Store and search Mauve Literary Fingerprint, Mauve as in the first two letters of Mo, Stellar, and Wallace. And you can download that. And as you do that, or as you look under the phone of someone next to you, I'll do a little demonstration. So essentially, I'm using the same methods that Mosto and Wallace did in 1960s in this little app. And obviously with today, there's different things with artificial intelligence and more advanced methods, but this process is so simple. This is the same process they did with cutting out words, and I just wanted to test, does it still work today? Does it work on novelists and people who kind of write longer form things? So once you've downloaded it, you'll get a little screen like this, and the default is Madison and Hamilton. I'm going to demonstrate it, and I'm going to send out some papers after, and you can play along in there. So this is the first paragraph of the very first Federalist paper. So how the app works, I don't know if you'll be able to see this as I do it, but you're just going to take a picture of the text, kind of perpendicular as possible. Hopefully the lighting is good. And then crop it around the box as tight as you can, just so your finger or your shadow or anything else is not in that. And then you can choose the photo, and what this app will do is it will convert the image file to a text file and then run the analysis to see, is this Madison or is this Hamilton? And again, it's not relying on phrases or anything like that. It's just looking at 70 basic words that Mosto and Wallace identified. They're all function words. They're here. A also, and very basic words. And it's this short sample, even this 200-word sample, enough to kind of guess who the most likely author is. So I'm writing it now. It's a bit slow. It's going to take about 30 to 90 seconds. But afterwards, hopefully, as long as I take the picture well enough while also trying to talk to you, it will count the words and spit out the results. And then once I do that, I have different excerpts from Federalist papers. No name on it. Hopefully you guys can run it on your own. And on top of that, I also have excerpts from different authors built in, and you can run it on that. Or if you get a bit creative, go out into the bookstore, find your favorite author who's also in this app, and try it on any page in any of their books. Should hopefully only be a few more seconds for time here. And this is a beta version of the app, so there are some glaring typos in it, but we will fix those before they get released to the public. Good. All right, so it has transcribed it. Hopefully that was close enough. So it guesses that based on the words upon, by, and there, that this is more similar to Hamilton than Madison. And in fact, I selected this ahead of time, so I knew it was going to happen. But this was the first Federalist paper, and this was written by Alexander Hamilton. And we know that both from Hamilton and Madison are so. Give it up for Hamilton. So if you want to just take a random page, if you download the app. So these all are signed by Publius, which is the pen name that they originally put on the Federalist papers when they were published. And the number at the bottom, don't crop those into the text, you don't need to. That corresponds to the number essay, a Federalist paper that is. And once you've done it, there's a chart up here. Either shout out the number or come up and see it. And it will tell you whether or not it was a confirmed Hamilton essay, a confirmed Madison essay, or an essay that people believe to be written by Madison, but that was disputed at the time. So hopefully this goes up. So hopefully this is entertaining, fun. It's a little bit of a game. Hopefully the papers make their way back. I don't know if anyone has any questions unrelated while people are doing it. Yes.
Oh, you have any theory about why Madison lied? Why Hamilton lied?
So there's it was years after the original essays were published, so he could have been forgetful. He did have a lot on his mind as he's
got 12 essays.
They're essays. This is one theory. He was about to duel Ehrenberg, so maybe he was kind of preoccupied. The other theory would just be that he was kind of, both of them were really, but also Hamilton kind of known to be a bit bodacious and kind of taking credit for as much as he could. But it's not just Mostly on the Wall. It's kind of after they published the results, historians went back and it's more or less like this result and other statistical results that Madison definitely was the author, and that for whatever reason Hamilton was overeager, and Madison's recollection was, even though it was like 13 years later, which was much stronger. Hope it works. So this, on that head-to-head setting, it should be about 85% accurate. On a longer sample size, obviously the error rate goes down and down. But hopefully it's fun to play along with.
Disagrees.
Yes.
What was one of your more interesting or surprising findings?
There's really a lot to kind of choose from. This book is structured in a way where each chapter is about something different. One chapter is about reading level, another is just about like book cover design and whether or not authors' books get longer and longer as their career goes on. One result that maybe the general trend wasn't surprising, but just kind of the strength of the finding was interesting, was I looked at the reading level of every novel from a #1 bestseller from 1960 to 2014. And the reading level formula is simple. It's just the length of the sentence and then the average length of each sentence in the book and the number of syllables on average in a book. So just a kind of word complexity and sentence complexity. And essentially the most complicated #1 bestseller written between 2010 and 2014 would have actually been the least complicated in terms of complexity between 1960 and 1965. So not only was it kind of like a steady decline or up and down that eventually went down, but the decline was so kind of sharp and consistent that really like no book that would have been popular then could have had a chance to be a #1 bestseller now. Yes?
How come you use simple words instead of like outlier words
Sure.
to
So this app, again, like looks at 70 basic words. I guess the immediate reason is that when Mostly on Walls were doing this, they were using 70 basic words, and to kind of show that I wasn't making this unnecessarily complicated or anything like that, I kind of wanted to replicate something that they could do in the 1960s. Beyond that, these words are good because they're kind of not genre dependent. You know, an author can change how they're writing. You know, Stephen King wrote under Richard Bachman. Those are kind of similar thriller type books, but he had viewed them as books that were not able to be published under his own name because he didn't think that they represented what he wanted to write. But if you kind of go through the numbers based on the simple words, you can kind of see his voice kind of still come through in that same way. And then that's just because kind of his sentence structure doesn't change over time, how he describes things doesn't change over time. Writers kind of have tick words, and some of these are a bit, you know, upon, also, would. Maybe some of these words are a bit different, and some authors do have kind of wild fluctuations between one another. Yes.
Have you found out what your favorite word is?
I did do the analysis. So one thing, unsurprisingly. So in the book, when I define favorite word, books that authors use repeatedly throughout all their books, and that kind of eliminates, you know, if you looked at one book, maybe something that's very specific to the plot. I did run it on this book, and unsurprisingly, probably was the word. But I think if you kept writing more and more books, probably would be the #1. And if you want to keep playing, these are now excerpts from random authors. And if you want to do that, if you go into the app and click Switch Authors, and then load up this screen. Just kind of guess which author you think it may be, just based on a brief sample of reading it. Maybe you have some idea, maybe you have no idea. Click on the authors, and then click All Authors, and then snapshot text, and then you can do the same process. So you take a picture, and it will guess how likely, compared to the other 20 authors, that author is to be the true author.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So, do you have any ballparks about what happened with sentence length between the 60s and today?
And also I should note that in the reading level decline, since there's two components to that formula, it was possible that decline maybe was just that sentences were getting simpler, but words were staying the same, or the opposite, where sentences were staying the same, but words were getting simpler. But I went through piecewise and kind of both areas. Sentences got shorter and the words got simpler. I think there's a few things going on. It's not necessarily that everyone's obviously writing that way, but the books that are capable of rising to the top, maybe kind of applied to a larger audience of readers, and kind of having a very simple, straightforward, direct writing style resonates with a larger base of readers. And I think also just kind of in the trend of how, and this is my subjective judgment based on the data, but just how people consume media and everything, there's more competition to books and maybe less focus on kind of literary or descriptive nature and poetic style of writing, as opposed to more writers expect maybe more action and conflict and things like that, which are less reliant on kind of intricate sentences and sentences that are maybe poetic and a bit longer.
Readers expect more.
I think readers kind of, like the general base of readers needed to get to the top of the bestseller list aren't as game for that. In the 1960s, obviously a lot of the bestsellers were still kind of like Robert Ludlum, and I guess he's a bit later, but people who were writing thrillers, and obviously bestsellers now, a lot of thrillers and romances. But back then, there was a bit more skew towards, it was a bit easier for a literary book to rise to the top occasionally, whereas now it's very rare.
If you did anything like Hemingway versus Fitzgerald, what were their top words?
Sure. So one of the chapters in the book, which is kind of where the title of the book comes from, is I guess took inspiration from a Ray Bradbury quote where he said in an interview, my favorite word is cinnamon because it reminds me of my grandmother's pantry. So I went through and it turns out he uses cinnamon, I forget the exact word, but about 5 or 6 times is likely as you'd expect normally compared to other authors. And also he uses just words like spice, spearmint, peppermint, lemon, licorice, just like any kind of pantry smell at a really extreme rate. So I kind of tried to define this thing called cinnamon words and kind of build a criterion with how often they use a word and then do they use it across all their books. So for Hemingway and Fitzgerald, I'm not doing it head-to-head, but I'm doing it against kind of the corpus of literature. So if I could find the correct chapter in here, hopefully not too long. There's 100 authors that I go through, and I kind of list the words that they use at an extreme rate. And these are usually words that, as opposed to those words which are function words, these are words which are a bit more kind of ticks or irregularities that you wouldn't expect maybe in any writing, but they use consistently. All right, I've just pulled up the chapter. So Hemingway is concierge and astern, and then Fitzgerald is facetious and muddled. So hopefully that reads through. There's a few authors that you read and maybe it doesn't make sense. There's some authors, for example, Jane Austen is civility, fancying, and imprudence. Which I think if you saw those, you may be able to guess theirs. And that's kind of on the very polite side. And then on the other side, you get an author like John Updike, and his favorite 3 words, according to this analysis, were rimmed, prick, and fucked. So kind of a big difference in just kind of the writing style and the tone. Yes.
What were a couple of the top books from the 60s and from the later period?
So from the later period, obviously it's very skewed, where it's a lot of James Patterson, Daniel Steele. I don't have the list of it within the notes here, so you'd have to go. I cite the website, so you'd have to go to that. But in the 1960s, I may be able to pull up, I guess there is one chart here which shows authors who had multiple bestsellers. There are some authors I know like James Michener who probably today would not have any chance of getting repeat #1 bestsellers because he's a bit more literary. But a lot of the authors are a bit more kind of, as you expect, thriller or romance. And I'm sorry, I can't find the exact page that has the chart for you. Yes.
What were some other ideas you had for the title?
I guess the working title was just writing by the numbers, very direct and straightforward. I think this is a bit more mysterious, but very happy with it. Yeah.
You can give this like a one-liner about your description of men and women writers. You said that there was a difference between the way they wrote.
Right. So for the men and women chapter, I guess one kind of thing I wanted to do, because there's a lot of studies kind of looking at social media use and how men and women write differently, and I thought it'd be cool since novels are sort of dependent on male and female characters. It's not just like how they write differently, but how they describe the other gender differently. So I guess one kind of big section is kind of very straightforward, but just look at pronoun use, he versus she, to see kind of the general character balance of the story. Just looking at those two pronouns, you can get a general sense of, how male-focused or how female-focused the book is. The Hobbit has one use of the pronoun she, about 2,000 E's, because Miss Bilbo Baggins was the only female character in The Hobbit, and everyone else is male. And I kind of went through the classic books as ranked by librarians, and these are kind of the books that, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Great Gatsby, books that you'd expect to be taught in high school and middle school and college. And the general sense was that these books, for female writers, are about 50-50 in terms of their pronoun usage, about pretty even balance of male and female characters. And for the male writers of these classic novels, it was usually around 75 to 80% male focused. So obviously, big difference there. There's lots of reasons. It could be that books that were more skewed the other way just haven't reached classic status because of historical reasons or because of the world we live in. Just it's hard to write a novel, especially 100 years ago that was more female focused. But there's a huge difference there. And then one of this quick thing I looked at in the book was kind of the words. For example, the word smiled is much more likely to be used to describe a female as opposed to, say, chuckled or grinned, which is very male-centric. And these aren't gendered words, but for literary writers, they kind of assign these verbs kind of unknowingly to one sex more often than the other. Yes,
Are you aware that half the comments on your review online are nerds freaking out because there is no Miss Bilbo Baggins in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit? Bilbo Baggins never got married. That's the only thing anyone's talking about.
I didn't know. I can't tell how true you are, but Bilbo have a.
I think it's his mom. Yeah.
His mom. Okay. Mrs. Baggins. Mrs. Baggins. You can retract all your comments. That's all. I guess that's all I prepared. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed playing around with the samples. If you've run the app and worked, didn't want to raise your hand and figure it out, you can run it again and then come check out the chart to see how accurate it was or not. But thank you all for coming out to Skylight. I had a good time.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. Don't forget that you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.